Hi, this is Dr. Gwen Fisher with Environmental and Occupational Health 6639, Occupational Health Psychology. This is Module 7, and in Module 7, we discuss theories and models of work stress. In other words, in this module, you will learn a lot more about the work stress process and the various theories that exist, particularly in occupational health psychology research, to explain the stress process. Here is the agenda for Module 7. In this module, we will discuss many theories of work stress, including the general adaptation syndrome, work by Dr. Hans Selye, the allostatic load model, the cognitive appraisal model or transactional model of stress by Lazarus and colleagues, the job demands control model, conservation of resources model, the job demands resources model, and then finally, implications for stress management based on these theories. There are 3 primary learning objectives for Module 7. It is my hope that by the end of this module, you will be able to understand the primary theories and models that have been studied in the work stress literature from its origins up through current research. Secondly, to understand key terms articulated by these theories. And finally, to identify ways in which these theories can be applied in work settings in an effort to reduce strain. The general adaptation syndrome is the first theory we will discuss in this module. The general adaptation syndrome refers to a physiological approach to understanding stress. This goes back to the 1940s and 1950s and was really at the origin of stress research. Dr. Selye was considered in many respects to be the father of work stress research, or the grandfather, if you will. And his model really helped us understand what are the physiological issues and what's happening with stress. The general adaptation syndrome refers to this fight or flight response that can take place when you are exposed to a particular stressor. It is a natural stress response and not one that you necessarily can control. According to the Mayo Clinic, when you encounter a perceived threat, for example, if a large dog barks at you during your morning walk, for instance, your hypothalamus, which is a tiny region at the base of your brain, sets off an alarm system. This is part of the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system, which provides a hormonal reaction. And then it is through a combination of nerve and hormonal signals that prompts your adrenal glands, which are located in your kidneys, to release a surge of hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline serves multiple purposes that can help our bodies during times of stress. Adrenaline, for example, will increase your heart rate, elevate your blood pressure, and boost your energy supplies. Whereas cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone, increases sugars or glucose in the bloodstream and enhances your brain's use of glucose and increases the availability of substances that can repair the tissue in your body. Cortisol also serves in a manner that curbs functions that are considered non-essential or detrimental in a fight or flight situation. It can also alter immune system responses and suppress the digestive system. So, for example, if you've ever noticed that after a period of prolonged stress, you find that you're more susceptible to the common cold or picking up whatever other germs or viruses might be floating around, it is not a surprise because your body can become immune compromised as a result of the increase in hormones. Those of you with a medical background, I'm sure, understand this at a much deeper, much better level. I refer all of you to the NIOSH video called Working with Stress, as well as other materials in the textbook that go into explain this process in a little bit more detail. But hopefully this just provides an overview and you understand a little bit more about this. This slide shows the 4 different phases of the general adaptation syndrome. In phase 1, this is when our bodies are functioning at a normal level of resistance, and our immune system is able to adapt and be responsive to stress over time. Phase 2 is when we are Well, between phase 1 and phase 2 is when we experience the onset of a particular stressor. And then here you see that the normal level of resistance drops as our body is working to address the issue of what's happening with the stressor. Moving into the third phase, shown here in orange, is the resistance phase. This is your body then responding. You have adrenaline, you have cortisol, and your body is working really hard internally to resist the stressor and deal with what you're facing. And then should that stressor not go away, phase 4 is the decomposition phase. This is when your body is no longer able to keep up and no longer able to resist. The next model that I'd like to discuss is the allostatic load model. I recommend that you read the review article by Drs. Ganster and Rosen as part of this module. And as you'll see from that reading, they explain the allostatic load model in much more detail. Just to provide a brief summary, the allostatic load model is based on the notion of allostasis, in which our body really seeks to maintain homeostasis or stability through change. The allostatic load that takes place is the wear and tear on the body over time. So the allostatic load model serves as a mechanism for explaining what happens to the body, particularly over time of dealing with chronic stressors. It says right here that really this is focused on chronic stressors rather than acute stress, because it's the ongoing nature of exposures to the stressors that are going to wear our bodies down and cause problems down the road, based on the physiological model, the general adaptation syndrome that I just spoke about previously. It's in that decomposition phase when our body is not able to rest and recover and get back to what we would think of as our normal level of functioning, we will get worn down. According to Drs. Ganster and Rosen, the allostatic load model is really a dominant approach to understanding stress physiology. It's gaining popularity across social science for understanding the stress process, as well as understanding many of the negative consequences that are associated with or result from stress. Next, I'd like to just talk about key terms regarding the stress process. It's important to think about stress as a process that unfolds over time. And that stress process is characterized by first the sources or the causes of stress, which we refer to as stressors. Those can be either acute, meaning short term, something that comes up right away and doesn't necessarily last, versus a chronic stressor, something that is more long term. An example of an acute stressor might be if a coworker or a supervisor yells at you at work. If you're anything like me, it doesn't really feel good to be yelled at, and I develop just a physiological immediate reaction if somebody's yelling at me. I'll get clammy, my stomach hurts, I feel a little bit like I was punched in the gut. A chronic stressor, on the other hand, is something of a more ongoing basis. That might be dealing with harassment in the work environment. It might be an ongoing issue based on work organization, based on the way work is structured in terms of work hours or a work schedule. It could be an ongoing situation with work-family conflict. During the rest of this course, we'll be talking about many different types of work-related occupational stressors and categorize them as either acute or chronic, as well as identify the sources so that then we can figure out what to do. In other words, how can we prevent the stressors or design an intervention to reduce the strains associated with them? Strains refer to the outcomes of the stress process. Typically, because stressors are not usually a positive thing, the strains that happen as a result are usually pretty negative things. Examples of strains include job dissatisfaction, sleep problems, anxiety, depression, depressive symptoms, and so forth. So this slide just shows briefly a model of the stress process, where stressors are the causes of stress or potential causes of stress, such as workload, time pressure, work interfering with non-work, or non-work or family activities or issues interfering with work. They have the potential to lead to strains, which, as I just indicated, are negative outcomes of the stress process, which may include these types of things. Also, in addition to what I mentioned on the previous slide, are things like relationship issues, as well as our physical health problems that can come about. Ways of addressing the stress process may include buffers, and we will talk in this course about potential buffers. Two that we know from the research literature that are very, very successful for minimizing the negative effect of stressors on strains include things like positive job characteristics, such as meaningfulness or autonomy, as well as social support and being involved in a work environment that is positive and supportive at the organizational, the supervisor, or the coworker level. A very, very important part of understanding the stress process is the psychological component, which indicates that there is a cognitive appraisal of stressors. The physiological model, based on Cellier's work and the general adaptation syndrome, describes the physiological stress process, which may be taking place whether we're conscious of it or not. And oftentimes we don't have control over, especially cognitive or psychological control, over our reaction to what's happening. It's just an immediate physiological reaction with a fight or flight response. On the contrary, or in a separate way, Lazarus and colleagues, such as Lazarus and Folkman back in 1984, published a book regarding stress and coping and talked about what we call the transactional model of stress. According to these researchers, cognitive appraisal is a really critical part of the stress process. And what this means is that our perceptions are really, really important for understanding what takes place and what our experiences of the environment are. In other words, you may find a particular situation is stressful, but maybe your spouse or partner or somebody that you work with at work don't, if they encounter a similar situation, do not experience it as stressful, or vice versa. In other words, two people in the same work environment may experience something similar, but may have different perceptions and different reactions to that situation. And this can be explained by the notion of cognitive appraisal and how you think about it and whether you perceive that stressor as a stressful situation or not. According to work by Lazarus and Folkman in their transactional model of stress, they identified two types of coping with stressors: problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping is aimed at reducing or eliminating the stressor. In other words, if you are, for example, dealing with somebody at work who tends to be uncivil and makes rude comments and is somebody who's just really not pleasant to be around, one example of a problem-focused coping approach is to just limit your interaction with that person and try to avoid interacting with them or working with them if at all possible. I realize oftentimes that's easier said than done, but problem-focused coping based on the literature has found to be really, really effective for reducing and eliminating stressors for exactly the notion that it's focused on targeting the problem and eliminating the problem. Emotion-focused coping also plays a very important role. It is aimed at dealing with or changing your emotions regarding the stressor. Sometimes it really helps us to cope with the situation by venting to others or sharing how we feel about a situation rather than just bottling it up inside and stuffing it in there and trying to pretend the situation doesn't exist. In general, past research has found that problem-focused coping is more effective than emotion-focused coping, but each one serves an important purpose in the stress coping process, and there are benefits to emotion-focused coping. This slide shows the job demands control model, which was developed and published by Robert Karasek back in the 1970s. The actual citation refers back to 1979, although this particular reference shown on this slide refers to where I was able to copy this particular model from. This model was already explained in the textbook chapter, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail explaining it and regurgitating it here. But the gist of the job demands control model indicates that jobs can vary on two dimensions. One is job demand, what is expected of you, and do you experience a low or high level of demand? And secondly, how much autonomy or job decision latitude do you have on the job? Do you have a lot of say, a lot of control or job decision latitude, or are you in a low autonomy job? Jobs that are characterized as not being very demanding and also not having a lot of job decision latitude are considered passive jobs. It's the notion of having a relatively simple job where someone tells you what to do and you do it, and the job demands are not too extreme, but you don't have to exert a ton of thought in terms of autonomy and so forth about the job. On the contrary, a really active job is one that is high in demands, but also where you have a high level of job decision latitude to be paired with those high level of demands. And according to this model, it's easier to manage the higher demands if you have high levels of autonomy, because you can be active in how you go about managing your work in that job. And then others that can be particularly put people at risk for psychological strain and physical illness are high strain jobs. Those are ones that are characterized as having high job demands, but also where there's a low level of autonomy. So whether it's a high degree of workload or other interpersonal or emotional demands as part of the job, and then not having much control or autonomy to be able to manage. Hopefully this makes sense, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. The conservation of resources model is another model of stress, which indicates that strain comes about from three different potential sources. One is that it's a loss in actual resources. Secondly, that you perceive a loss in resources. Or third, it's that there's a failure to gain expected resources. So let's say, for example, that you find out from work that although you aren't going to lose your job, that they're going to cut your pay. And so you're actually going to lose resources in the form of less pay over time. Chances are that would result in some degree of strain. It might be strain in terms of job dissatisfaction. It might be frustration. You might become depressed as a result of that. There are many different possible results that could happen from an actual loss in resources. Another source, according to the conservation of resources model, would be a perceived loss of resources. So just a perception that you are not getting maybe the same level of pay or other resources maybe as other people, or if pay is a difficult one to discuss with regard to perceived loss of resources, simply because it's pretty concrete. But it might have to do with how much support you're given from your supervisor, how much direction you're given, how much you're challenged, and so forth. An example of failing to gain expected resources is, imagine a situation where your boss tells you that you've been doing a really good job and they're going to give you a raise. And so you get really excited. Maybe you start thinking, hey, we can maybe afford that vacation that we've put on hold because we haven't had the money for it. Now you can do it. And then you find out maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, your boss comes to you and said, I'm really sorry, but we're not going to be able to give you that raise that we promised because we recently had a budget problem or a budget issue or something lost an account and they can no longer afford to pay you that extra money. It could be that nothing has really changed with regard to your paycheck. They didn't actually take money away from you, but chances are this feels equally as crummy because you were expecting that you were going to get this additional money and then you didn't, and therefore it feels like, well, it is literally that you did not gain resources that you were expecting. So according to this model, the stress process comes about because individuals are motivated to acquire as well as to conserve resources, where resources are characterized as objects, personal characteristics, conditions, energies, and so forth. We could think of our health or our physical energy as a resource. We could think of time, maybe materials that we need on the job to get our work done. The notion of a resource is really quite broad. In the occupational health psychology literature, This model is used pretty frequently to describe a number of different things, though at the same, and examples of those are as follows. So the conservation of resources model has been used for describing work-family conflict, burnout, emotional labor, the extent to which we have to deal with emotional situations at work and display, perhaps act in one way at work toward patients or clients, which might reflect a way that's a little bit different than how we feel inside. Or it could be our job-related functional capacity, which the jargony term for that is work ability. So those are just some examples from the research literature of how the conservation of resources model has been used. It's important to indicate that on one hand, it's great that we can think of lots and lots of different types of resources. On the other hand, Ganster and Rosen criticized this model because according to this model, just about anything can be a resource and it's really quite broad. And according to Ganster and Rosen, this model just lacks some of the specifics to really be really quite predictive. The job demands resources model is very similar to the job demands control model, and it's also aligned well with the conservation of resources model that I just described. You're probably quite familiar with this model based on the recent paper by Bakker and Demiruti. There was a review paper published in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology in 2017 as a follow-up to some of their original research that goes back to 2001 and also the one cited here in 2007. Nonetheless, according to this model, job demands refer to physical, psychological, social, or organizational aspects of the job that require sustained physical or psychological effort. In other words, cognitive and emotional effort on the job or skills, and therefore these demands are associated with certain physiological or psychological costs. In other words, these demands of the job can just take resources away from us or deplete our resources. On the other hand, resources are physical, psychological, social, or organizational aspects of the job that help us in achieving work goals. They can be functional, they can help reduce job demands. Having more resources can serve as a buffer or give us energy back. Having time can provide us with maybe the opportunity to get more done and manage a heavy workload. And by reducing job demands and the associated physiological and psychological costs can be quite beneficial. Resources can stimulate personal growth, learning, and development. So according to the job demands resources model, if job demands are high and resources are not at a level that meet or exceed job demands, then an individual is likely to experience negative outcomes such as strain. In other words, we need a level of resources commensurate with our job demands in order to not experience too much stress. On the other hand, if we have resources that meet or exceed those job demands, then chances are the stress process will be less likely to be initiated. The job demands resources model has become incredibly popular in occupational health psychology and really beneficial for understanding many aspects of work stress because so much of work can be conceptualized on the basis of different types of job demands as well as different types of resources. And this notion of having a balance or a seesaw between job demands and resources seems to make a lot of psychological sense. Examples of job demands include workload, role overload, having too much to do as part of your work role, and time pressure. These are not to say that these are the most prevalent sources of job stress, but they are common across many different kinds of jobs and oftentimes prevalent, especially among people in professional type jobs. This slide shows an example of some survey items that can measure time pressure. For example, I never seem to have enough time to get everything done. I have too much work to do everything well, and I'm rushed in doing my job. This slide shows measures of decision authority based on a publication by my graduate advisor, Carla Smith, and her other colleagues that examined the measurement of job control. So these 3 survey items can be used to assess decision authority or autonomy or job control. Note that the R for the 3rd item indicates that the item should be reverse scored when statistically calculating results from the survey. In other words, you would reverse the values assigned to that survey item in order to have the values be aligned well with the first 2. The items as shown here, my job allows me to make a lot of decisions on my own. I have a lot of say about what happens on my job. And on my job, I have very little freedom to decide how I work. Briefly, this shows some examples of items that measure skill discretion. This again goes back to the job characteristics model that you learned about in a previous module in terms of job attitudes. And these survey items can be quite useful for measuring job discretion. That concludes Module 7 on theories of work stress. The next module will talk about organizational stressors and interpersonal stressors.